The Chicago Bears followed their similar pattern in free agency, spending money without handing out the biggest contracts at any position. It was good value for Ryan Poles on the first day of free agency, but the moves he made still do come with some risk.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, we recap a wild first day of NFL free agent negotiation period. The Bears agreeing to terms with center Drew Dalman, defensive end Dayo Odeyingbo, and Atlanta Falcons defensive tackle Grady Jarrett. A lot to break down with all three of those moves, but I think there's some similarities in all three where it's like these are veterans that can come in and stabilize three positions that are important and that were big needs. Each one has a lot to like. Each one has some financial flexibility, and each one also has some risk involved with it. And I think each one has a different calculation of that risk that makes it an interesting thing to watch how this plays out for the Chicago Bears moving forward. Of the three, I think Drew Dalman is still going to be the most important player in terms of not having an alternative option if this one doesn't work out, right? Like on the defensive line with Odeyingbo and Grady Jarrett, if something goes wrong there, you've got other guys you can rotate in. There's other ways you can generate a pass rush if something goes wrong with one of those guys. But if something goes wrong with Drew Dalman as your center, your backup options are not going to be nearly as good, and you're going to have a bigger problem. It's harder to protect. So Dalman, to me, is the most important of the three signings in a vacuum, for his individual position. Obviously, the best center available on the free agent market, the top contract handed out to a center. And yet, even at $14 million a year, the contract that Drew Dalman got, it still wasn't the kind of thing that has to then break the bank for the Chicago Bears, right? Dalman, once he goes on the Bears salary cap, he'll only be their sixth highest paid player against the cap, maybe seventh, depending on where Jonah Jackson's number ultimately ends up falling in there. And then I suppose Odeyingbo and Grady Jarrett will bump it up, so 8th, 9th. Like, he won't be in the top 5 highest paid Bears, even though he's maybe the second highest paid center in football. But you look around the rest of the free agent offensive line market, and the money was getting handed out really thoroughly to some lesser players getting paid a lot more. The Titans signed Steelers left tackle Dan Moore for $20.5 million a year. Aaron Banks, the 49ers guard, goes to the Packers for $19.25 million a year. Even the Chiefs signed left tackle Jalen Moore for $15 million a year. Like, Drew Dalman slots in below all of those other players, gets a little bit more than like Patrick McCarry got, who wasn't even like a full-time starter at one spot, still gets $12.5 million per year. So, like, we knew offensive linemen on the market were going to get significant salaries, and we're going to get paid a lot, and it's why the Bears prioritized trading for the likes of Jonah Jackson and Joe Thuney as opposed to trying to sign sign free agent guards that were likely going to cost more than, and that clearly are showing that they cost more than either of those guys. I think the hard part for me a little bit is Colts center Ryan Kelly ends up signing on a pretty affordable deal there. I think 2 years, was it $18 million on that contract with $9 million guaranteed. I can't help but feel like Ryan Kelly is not that much worse than Drew Dalman. He's just older, about 5 years older, so he's much more of a short-term option. And the Bears wanted to go with the younger player still entering his prime in Dalman, and that I certainly understand and think the Bears don't want to have to find a center replacement this offseason for the long-term future, just like they have to find long-term futures at guard here. So having Dalman locked in, I think, is something that gives them more stability in the long run, even if I think Ryan Kelly is not that much worse of a player for a cheaper price tag. You're paying for the youth, the age, the ability for Dalman to continue to improve as he moves forward in his career. Because there's been plenty of consternation about, okay, exactly how good is Drew Dalman? And I think, okay, he's not a Pro Bowl caliber center, but he's an above average starting center. And I think that's fine to pay $14 million for. I mean, other lesser guards are going to get more money than he did. So to pay, yes, centers don't get paid as much, but like if you divide the offensive line into 5 pieces, $14 million for an above average player is not a bad use of money overall. You look back this past season, Next Gen Stats put out the stat graphic on social media that Drew Dalman had the second highest rate of one-on-one blocks in pass protection among centers this season. He was one-on-one on 45% of his pass blocks this past season, really not getting a lot of help, and was 5th in pressure rate allowed on those one-on-one blocks. So like he was left alone a lot and did really well in those one-on-one blocks this past season in pass protection. Plus he's known as more of a run blocker. Sure, I think there's going to be times when Drew Dalman gets beat. And there's going to be times where it's like, man, like he's not a Pro Bowl, All-Pro, top 5 center in the NFL, but he might be a top 10 center in the NFL. He's in that 5 to 12 type range, 5 to 15 type range. Like we'll see how it plays out over the rest of the season. But having Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson next to him certainly will go a long way towards helping him and giving him plenty of support. I think the bigger concern for me with Dalman, or the biggest of all this, is just the slight durability question there. He played 9 games this past season, 14 the year before that, and both years dealing with ankle injuries. And you don't like to see repeat injury becoming a trend with a player like that. I was talking to Aaron Freeman, our host of Locked On Falcons here, and I texted him. I was like, is this Drew Dalman thing like just got unlucky 2 years in a row with ankle injuries, or is it a sign of like, hey, maybe there's a lingering ankle issue there overall? And he said it leans a little bit more like unlucky, unfortunate, but just the fact that there have been these back-to-back years, it's sort of it's a slight durability question mark that had Falcons fans and the Falcons maybe a little hesitant to pay Drew Dalman in some similar ways, but not to the same extent as like Tevin Jenkins, right? No doubting Tevin Jenkins is a very good player, but your willingness to pay him depends on your trust of that injury. Now, Dalman has been healthier generally and has started a full season before, and even a 14-game season 2 years ago is not really all that much to be concerned about. So I'm not overly concerned, like, oh no, this has been some bad move all of a sudden. I think this was a necessary signing. You had to stabilize the center position with a veteran. This was the best option available, the best young option available, and someone who I think will be a good fit in this Bears offense. It's not a guarantee. It's not necessary. Free agents don't always work out. Free agents have a lot of risk, and I think the risk for Dalman is whether or not this ankle thing is going to continue to be a problem. But I think all in all, well, he might not be the second best center in football that his contract says. Like when you sign a free agent, you have to pay him higher than you'd like to in order to get him in your building. And I think it's a necessary evil to pay Drew Dalman this much to just answer that question mark on the Bears offensive line and not make it some competition or go cheap there and say, well, we're just going to try and have Coleman Shelton compete against Ryan Bates. No. Get a definitive answer there that Caleb Williams can work with all offseason. And I think it's a very necessary move. It doesn't stop me from drafting a center. Doesn't stop me from drafting guards. Like I still want to invest in the offensive line in the draft. I still think they need to sign some better backup interior linemen as well and backup tackles as well. The free agent offensive line moves are not done, but I do think the big splashes may be done in free agency, at least the expensive ones. Maybe I'll end up eating my words on that. But the Bears spent big money on Dalman and Dayo Odeyingbo and Grady Jarrett. I don't know that they have another 8-figure contract up their sleeve here. They'll still sign some lesser guys that might make more than veteran minimum, but not the big splashes, especially because you put all your investment in the O-line and in the D-line. That's where the needs were that needed to be met. I want to turn our attention to that defensive line and start with the guy that maybe we know less about in Indianapolis Colts defensive end, Dayo Odeyingbo, next on Locked On Bears. This episode is sponsored by Betterhelp. Taking care of your mental health can feel like a big investment, but it's just as important as taking care of your bodies. You might pay for a gym membership, you pay for healthy foods to make sure you're putting the right things in your body. So why not invest in your mental well-being too? BetterHelp offers a flat fee for weekly online therapy sessions, making professional support more accessible and affordable. With over 30,000 therapists and over 5 million people helped, it's the world's largest online therapy platform. I do online therapy myself, and it's a really important part of my own personal mental health regimen. It's not like you have to be going through a major crisis to benefit from therapy. Sometimes it's just about having somebody to talk to. Your well-being is worth it. So visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's 10% off your first month at BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. After investing so much in the offensive line through trades and the first signing of Bears free agency, or the first free agent agreement, not technically signed until Wednesday, Ryan Poles then turned his attention to the defensive line, and boom, back-to-back. Defensive end Dayo Odeyingbo from the Indianapolis Colts, and then defensive tackle Grady Jarrett from the Atlanta Falcons. Two guys in very different positions of their career, at least that style of position. One on the inside, one on the outside here. And Odeyingbo is a really interesting signing, someone we talked about a little bit throughout this process, because Bears linebackers coach was previously the linebackers coach in Indianapolis, not directly coaching the defensive line and Dayo Odeyingbo, but Richard Smith was there from 2022 to 2024 for 3 seasons of Odeyingbo in Indy. So he sees how Odeyingbo tries at practice, how he is in the weight room, in the locker room, how he takes care of his body in the offseason. Like, there's a slightly increased level of familiarity there than you would get with a free agent, from somewhere else, from another team, like a true outside free agent there. So the crossover there helps ease some of that transition for you to know what you're getting there. Odeyingbo is a player who hasn't had significant injury issues over the course of his career, but is very young, and you're signing Dayo Odeyingbo with the hopes that his best football is still in front of him. He's 25 years old, will turn 26 in September at the start of the season, and is still an ascending player. This past season, 2024, was his first year as a full-time starter in this Colts defense, and had, I think, 12 or 13 quarterback hits this past season, really consistently at least getting to the quarterback, even if it only resulted in 3 total sacks. That jumps out right away as something that could be a red flag, but he had 8 sacks the year before, and sometimes the difference between a quarterback hit and a sack is just a matter of whether the QB throws the ball a second earlier or holds onto the ball a second longer. He clearly is someone who can get after the quarterback and be an effective player in that regard, and he's a good fit for what Dennis Allen tends to prefer in his defensive ends. He's built very similarly to Cam Jordan of the New Orleans Saints at over 6'5", 285 pounds, 35-inch arms. Like, this is in the physical mold of Cam Jordan, and you hope that Dennis Allen can help coach him up to play more like that caliber of a player. To try and put it in perspective here, of like, Dayo Odeyingbo is definitely an upgrade over the likes of DeMarcus Walker and what the Bears had in the past, but he's also not as consistent of a pass rusher as some of the guys that were also available in free agency, but he didn't cost as much as some of the other guys available in free agency. So, like, if we look at, like, I like to look at pass rush win rate more specifically than just the sack number is only a handful of plays out of the hundreds of pass rushes that he has. But if you look at pass rush win rate, which just measures how many times does he beat the offensive lineman across from him. Doesn't matter whether it's a hurry, a hit, a sack, or none of the above, but if he wins his pass rush and the quarterback gets rid of the ball, like, how often is he actually winning in those rushes? And Dayo Odeyingbo last season had a pass rush win rate of 12.6, which ranked 46th among edge rushers, which doesn't sound great on the surface. I will say he was ranked one spot below Max Crosby, who was, I think, 44th or 45th at like 12.7%. So, like, Odeyingbo and Crosby basically won as pass rushers at a nearly identical rate this past season. That doesn't tell the whole story of how good they are as football players, but it gives you a sense of, okay, like, this, where this stat is measuring. But, like, for comparison, Trey Hendrickson ranked 4th in the NFL at 20%. So Odeyingbo's at 12.6, Trey Hendrickson's at 20%. So, like, significant winning pass rush rate, significantly higher, but that's the difference between the 4th best and the 46th best. But it's not that Odeyingbo then is bad. If you think about, like, every team starts 2 edge rushers, that'd be 64 players. Odeyingbo ranks 46th. And then you add in all of the number 3 and number 4 pass rushers that also rotate in. Like, he's an upper, average to above average pass rush win rate. But it's below, where Montez Sweat was at 14.7, or Khalil Mack was at 15.1, Josh Sweat was at 15.7. Like, the other bigger name options were around 15%. Dayo Odeyingbo's at 12.6. Like, yeah, he's a step below where some of those other pass rushers are, but he's above where DeMarcus Walker was last season at 11.1. So, right, there's the idea is that he's winning his pass rushes at a better rate than what the Bears had. And also, like, this was his first full year as a starter. He's 25 years old, that you think by age 26, age 27 season, he can still get better compared to guys like Sweat and Mack and Hendrickson that are much more advanced into their careers. And the nice thing is you're not paying Dayo Odeyingbo at the same level of some of those other guys. You know, you look at some of the contracts that have been handed out in the first day of free agency. Like Gregory Rousseau of the Bills re-signs on a contract extension for $20 million a year. Josh Sweat gets $19 million a year. Khalil Mack gets 1 year, $18 million fully guaranteed. Like Odeyingbo's clearly slotting in below those guys. He's just above guys like Harold Landry and Hassan Reddick, who got $14 million. Like Harold Landry from the Titans was cut as a cap casualty on his previous contract of $17.5 million. As a cap casualty now jumps down to $14.5 million. It's like that's where Odeyingbo is slotting in among these free agents. Like, yeah, he's not as good of a pass rusher as Sweat and Mack, but he's not getting paid as much as Sweat and Mack. And if he can continue to ascend in the future and become a better pass rusher as his career goes on, he can certainly make that an even better value for the Bears if he makes that progress. And that's kind of the caveat here, right? That if he makes that progress, like if Dayo Odeyingbo never gets any better than exactly what he is right now, he's probably not worth $16 million. He's probably not worth a lot less than $6. You know, he's probably, it's hard to put a number on it, right? Like, is he worth 14 then or 12, right? But this is, you know, he hasn't fully been every year a $16 million a year player. If he gave you 8 sacks a year, that's a $16 million player. 3 sacks last season, but with a pretty good pass rush win rate, tells you like, okay, he's getting there. And the idea is that if you put him in a defense in Chicago with Montez Sweat, and now with Grady Jarrett and Gervon Dexter and Andrew Billings, that a better pass rush around him will give him easier pass rush opportunities to help him be the best player he can be. I mean, it's not as though he was on a bad defensive line in Indianapolis with, you know, Kwity Paye and DeForest Buckner and Grover Stewart in there, but I think those guys were getting a little bit, you kind of had the mix of old and young there, and I think there's more room for Odeyingbo to grow into a bigger and more productive role. And on top of that, like, the Bears are going to still add something at defensive end, right? They're not just going to go in with their defensive line depth chart the way it sits right now, where your edges are Sweat and Odeyingbo, and then Austin Booker is your number 3, and Dominique Robinson is your number 4. Like, whether it's a rookie or another veteran free agent, I think some sort of additional defensive end is coming for this team, just to give them another more experience, another higher quality backup, not necessarily more experience, because it could be a rookie, it could be as early as a first round pick in there, but it's not as though Odeyingbo is going to be solely responsible for all of the pass rush opposite Montez Sweat. Plus you add in all that boost to the interior pass rush, and you can start to feel like, okay, the Bears have an improved defensive line from last season. How much improved? We'll see how much of a step Odeyingbo takes forward, how healthy Andrew Billings is, what Gervon Dexter and Zach Pickens can do now in year 3 of their careers, and then also what the Bears get from new defensive tackle Grady Jarrett, who has played at a high level for his entire career, but is also, you know, drifting towards the tail end of that career. And while I think the Bears also got good value for Grady Jarrett, it's a little bit dependent for him on how long that continues to hold up. So we'll take a look at how Jarrett's contract compared to some of the other big money handed out to defensive tackles and how this is all going to work in the Bears' defensive line rotation next on Locked On Bears. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting and wondering and worrying some more. But now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who could do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back, guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. The Bears go young in Dayo Odeyingbo to older in 32-year-old Grady Jarrett, a player who was just released by the Atlanta Falcons on Monday as a salary cap casualty, and seemingly before the ink was dry on his pink slip, the Bears swooped in and made sure to get a deal done. I should say Jarrett is 31 right now, but he turns 32 like right on draft day, so he'll be 32 functionally for all of next season. He's been with the Falcons for the last 10 seasons, made the Pro Bowl a couple times in there, and generally has a strong reputation as one of the better, more consistent interior defensive linemen in football. Now, this past season felt like a little bit of a drop-off, gets down to just 2.5 sacks. Again, I'm not here to use sacks as the end-all be-all, but I think in the running game there was a little bit of a drop-off and you start to wonder a little bit, okay, like is Grady Jarrett losing a step? The Bears are certainly counting on that not being the case, but the pressures were down a little bit, the hits were down a little bit. The year before that, 2023, he was injured for half the season. I want to say it was a torn ACL, I think, in 2023. So you kind of wonder, like, okay, is that what's contributing to the drop-off, or is he a guy who's going to be just fine and ultimately, bounce back? Because we've seen defensive tackles in particular have long lengths of their career. Guys at that position have been able to play, later and later and still play at a high level. So I'm not totally scared off of Jarrett, potentially being too old or, completely washed at this point. I think about somebody like Chris Jones with the Kansas City Chiefs still playing at a really high level as he gets onto the wrong side of 30. Cam Hayward for the Pittsburgh Steelers has still played at a really high level. Jeffrey Simmons is getting up there for the Titans, but still playing at a high level. Like, there's a lot of these guys that have been able to have long careers and still play very well at that spot. You just don't have to be, it's not about speed. You can lose a step of speed and you're going to be just fine at the defensive tackle spot. And so I think for Grady Jarrett, there's a certain level of like floor that I think you're going to get. He's not going to be bad. It's a question of how good Jarrett is. And that torn ACL is like really the only major injury he's had in his career. He's otherwise been a very durable player, and he was able to play all of last season and play a significant number of snaps last season for the Falcons. So I'm not really worried about the body breaking down in that regard as much. It's more about, the level of play. And I like then that when you add him to a Chicago Bears defensive line that already has Billings, Dexter, and Zach Pickens, and they re-signed Chris Williams on a restricted free agent tender, like, you can rotate Grady Jarrett so he doesn't have to play 700 snaps again this season. He's still going to be your starter for sure. Jarrett and Billings are your starting defensive tackles. Javon Dexter is coming off the bench. There's no question or doubt about that. But you can rotate these guys in frequently enough, like the Philadelphia Eagles do with their defensive line, that no one gets gassed, no one is out of breath, and you can always have fresh legs on the field. It could easily be a situation where Jarrett is the starter, but over the course of the year, Javon Dexter actually ends up playing more snaps off the bench because you just end up rotating Jarrett out more often, and Dexter is younger and has more stamina or whatever, can play more. And I think it's a great way for all these guys to be able to be maximized a little bit better there. And you're getting Grady Jarrett then on a discount from where he was on his previous contract with the Atlanta Falcons, a salary cap casualty for them. He signs with the Bears on a pay cut from what he was getting from Atlanta. Still a decent contract. I think it's averaging him, $14.5 million this season. But again, I look at the free agent defensive tackle market, and all these other guys are getting more money than Grady Jarrett that I'm not positive are, consistently better players than Grady Jarrett all the time. Like, obviously, Milton Williams gets the biggest money to go from the Eagles to the Patriots, $26 million a year, like almost double what Grady Jarrett gets per year. That's crazy money for a defensive tackle. Whereas like Osa Odigizua stays with the Cowboys for $20 million a year. Tershawn Wharton goes from the Chiefs to the Panthers for $18 million a year. And like Tershawn Wharton's a guy who is not a household name. Don't feel stupid if you don't know who Tershawn Wharton is. I mean, he had 6.5 sacks this season and kind of a breakout player for the Chiefs, but other than that, was never a starter before this season. Has a decent year on that defensive line, and then cashes into the tune of $18 million a year. Like, I think I would prefer an older Grady Jarrett at $14.5 million a year than Tershawn Wharton at $18 million a year, or Javon Kinlaw gets $15 million a year as he leaves the Jets after 1 year as a starter there, four and a half sacks. Like, he flashed with the 49ers, gets the 1 year kind of prove it deal with the Jets, and kind of proves it, has a decent season, but $15 million, like more than Grady Jarrett, like that to me feels like better value for Jarrett at that point. And I think what scares me a little bit more about Grady Jarrett is the guaranteed money. All three of the contracts the Bears signed these players to were all 3-year deals with the first 2 years guaranteed and the third year not guaranteed. Essentially, it's a 2-year deal with a team option on the end. So if one of these guys doesn't pan out, you're locked into him this year, and you're probably locked into him next year, and then after that, you can get rid of him. And I think Jarrett is the one, like, just because of his age, that you're like, okay, do you want to be locked into him for 2 more seasons for sure? Like, we're all hopeful, and with all likelihood, the Bears will get 2 good seasons out of Grady Jarrett. But of the 3, who's least likely to get 2 good seasons out of? I mean, just because he's older, right? That might be Grady Jarrett at that point, just because there have been signs. Like, think about it from a Keenan Allen perspective. Like, this is kind of what it feels like. And do you want to be locked into 2 guaranteed years of Keenan Allen? I mean, maybe it'll be fine, but there's some risk there. Just like there's risk that if Drew Dalman has another ankle injury this season, like, you're still locked in for 2 years of Drew Dalman. Or, if Dayo Odeyingbo doesn't take a step forward and has a kind of a down year, you're locked in for another year of that. Like, at least with both of those players, they're young enough that if year 1 doesn't go well, you're not going to cut them right away because you're optimistic that year 2 can go better. But if for some reason something goes wrong with Grady Jarrett in year 1, do you think it's going to go better as he gets even older in year 2? Like, that's where I think Jarrett is both, maybe the riskiest of the 3 signings, but also in some ways like the spot that you can afford it the most, or the luxury the most, because you have other things at defensive tackle. Okay, worst case scenario with Grady Jarrett, you still have Gervon Dexter, who could be a starter. You still have Zach Pickens that maybe can become something. You still have other depth at defensive tackle. The Bears are also still going to kick defensive ends inside on passing situations. Guys like Dayo Odeyingbo and Montez Sweat can kick into defensive tackle, and you can put Austin Booker on the field at edge. So, like, Jarrett's a little bit more of a luxury signing, where if he doesn't pan out the way you want him to, you're not as screwed as if Drew Dalman doesn't pan out the way you want him to, which would be the most screwed. And then you do need a good, consistent threat on the opposite side of Montez Sweat. You're counting on Odeyingbo to be a really good player there, and that would be a little bit harder to absorb. Whereas Jarrett's the one where it's like, it's great to have that force on the interior, someone who's going to attract a lot of double teams, even if he's not getting as many sacks. Like, he's got that reputation, that gravitational pull. Like, ultimately, I think these are all good fits for the Bears and generally good value for the Bears. But I also know that history has shown us that not every free agent signing is going to work out exactly the way you think it is. And, like, odds are one of these 3 players isn't going to be as good as the Bears want them to be. Like, just probabilities, right? Like, not all free agents are going to hit. And you hope that you get at least 50% of them. And so we could say 2 of the 3 here could be good players, and then maybe one of them isn't going to work out the way you want to. That's just the nature of the beast in free agency. There's always flaws with these players. And so I just want to, I want us to celebrate that these are good value that fill big needs for the Bears so they can go into the NFL draft and draft best player available and not be forced to take a pass rusher or forced to take a center if there's just not one there that they want on the board. But we can also prepare ourselves for the idea that, hey, these don't always work out. And like in the past, we've been excited about Nate Davis coming in and solidifying the Bears offensive line because he was pretty solid in Tennessee, and just things you can't prepare for or can't know in advance sometimes happen and make these moves not pan out. So let's not get too ahead of ourselves and give the Bears the offseason Lombardi Trophy again for the 3rd year in a row before we actually see the entirety of what the offseason brings and how these moves translate onto the field on Sundays. I still think these are prudent moves. I like these moves better than giving Milton Williams $26 million or giving Aaron Banks $19 million. I think Ryan Poles did a good job of limiting some of the risk by limiting some of the money he spent, by getting good value and still getting. These are good football players. These are not bad players, and they generally don't have many red flags. It's about as good as you could hope to do in free agency. I'm just always weary of getting too caught up in all of your problems being instantly solved by free agents. Curious to see what Ryan Poles has still up his sleeves for the rest of this free agent period. You can be sure we're going to break down every Bears signing and trade all offseason long right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming back tomorrow for more free agency updates and another opportunity for you to bear down.